Someone who procrastinates sits down to work on something important. They open their laptop. They arrange their desk. They make a cup of coffee. They check their phone. They organize files. They don't need to organize. They research one more thing they already know. They tell themselves they'll start in 5 minutes, then 10, then after lunch, then tomorrow. And if you've ever been that person, and the chances are you have, then you know this isn't laziness. This isn't poor time management. This is something far more complex. This is your mind protecting you from something it has decided is more dangerous than the consequences of not doing the work at all. People who chronically procrastinate carry a particular kind of weight, not the weight of the tasks they're avoiding, but the weight of the guilt, shame, and self-criticism that comes from constantly disappointing themselves. They watch deadlines approach like slow-motion disasters they can see coming but can't seem to prevent. They experience the anxiety of unfinished work as a constant background noise in their lives. And the strangest part is that they often care deeply about what they're avoiding. They want to do it. They know they need to do it. But when the moment comes to actually start, something inside them freezes, and they find themselves doing anything, absolutely anything, except the thing that matters most. Someone asks, "Why don't you just do it?" You know it needs to be done. And you don't know how to explain that just doing it isn't a simple decision. That the gap between knowing you should do something and being able to actually do it is filled with invisible obstacles. That your procrastination isn't about discipline or willpower. It's about fear. Fear of failure. Fear of success. Fear of judgment. Fear of not being perfect. Fear of confronting the gap between how you see yourself and how you might actually perform. And that fear, though it sounds irrational when spoken aloud, feels absolutely real when you're sitting in front of a blank page or an unstarted project. Most people think procrastination is about avoiding work, but people who live with chronic procrastination understand the truth. It's not work they're avoiding. It's the emotions that come with the work. The anxiety of starting something you're not sure you can finish well. The vulnerability of putting something out into the world that can be judged. The discomfort of doing something imperfectly when your self-worth is tied to being competent. The overwhelm of a task that feels too big to tackle. Procrastination becomes a way of regulating these emotions, a way of protecting yourself from feelings you don't know how to process. And in that moment of avoidance, you get temporary relief. You push the discomfort into the future, and that relief, brief ascites, reinforces the pattern. There is a split in you, a war between the part that wants to achieve and the part that's terrified of what achievement requires. You set intentions, you make plans, you genuinely mean to follow through. But when the time comes, another part takes over, the part that whispers reasons to delay. Just a few more minutes. You work better under pressure anyway. This isn't the right time. You need to be in the right mood. You should prepare more first. And these whispers feel logical in the moment. They feel like reasonable assessments. But they're not. They're your mind's way of negotiating with fear, of finding justification for the avoidance that feels necessary for your emotional survival in that instant. People who chronically procrastinate often carry an invisible curriculum. They know what it's like to have brilliant ideas they never execute. They know the shame of last-minute panic, of producing work that's below their capability because they waited too long to start. They know what it's like to let people down repeatedly, including themselves. They know the exhaustion of living with constant low-level anxiety about unfinished tasks. They know how to appear busy while accomplishing nothing meaningful. They develop elaborate rituals of avoidance that others mistake for productivity. But these aren't conscious choices. They're psychological defense mechanisms operating below the level of awareness. Research in psychology shows that chronic procrastination is strongly linked to perfectionism, fear of failure, low self-worth, and difficulty regulating emotions. When someone has learned that their value is tied to their performance, when mistakes feel like evidence of fundamental inadequacy rather than normal parts of learning, when criticism feels like an attack on their identity rather than feedback on their work, then starting something becomes incredibly threatening. Because starting means risking. And risking means potentially confirming the fear that you're not good enough. So the mind finds a way to avoid the risk entirely. It procrastinates and procrastination. While it creates problems, also creates a convenient explanation. You didn't fail because you're incapable. You failed because you didn't have enough time. The potential remains protected. The ego remains intact. There's a particular shame that people who procrastinate carry, a shame that's compounded by the fact that they know what they're doing. They're not oblivious. They watch themselves avoid. They recognize the pattern. They criticize themselves mercilessly for it. But the self-criticism doesn't help. It makes it worse. Because now, they're not just dealing with the anxiety of the task. They're also dealing with the shame of their own behavior. And shame is paralyzing. It doesn't motivate. It freezes, so they procrastinate more, which creates more shame, which makes it harder to start, which leads to more procrastination. The cycle becomes self-perpetuating. What makes this particularly painful is how it affects self-perception. People who chronically procrastinate often see themselves as lazy, undisciplined, weak-willed failures. They internalize the criticism they receive from others and from themselves. They develop an identity around being someone who can follow through. And this identity becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. When you believe you're someone who procrastinates, when that becomes part of how you understand yourself, then changing the behavior means changing your identity. And identity change is one of the most difficult psychological processes humans can undertake. It's easier to stay consistent with who you believe you are, even when that consistency keeps you stuck. People who procrastinate often have a complicated relationship with time. Deadlines that are far away feel infinite. They tell themselves they have plenty of time. But time is a strange thing for a procrastinator. It doesn't move linearly. It collapses suddenly. What was weeks away becomes tomorrow without any felt sense of the days passing. And then panic sets in. The adrenaline starts flowing. And sometimes, only sometimes, the panic creates enough activation energy to overcome the avoidance. They work in a frantic rush, producing something that's usually less than their capability, promising themselves they'll never do this again. And then the cycle repeats. There's also a way that procrastination becomes a form of rebellion. For people who grew up with intense pressure to perform, with parents or teachers or circumstances that demanded constant productivity, procrastination can be an unconscious way of reclaiming control, a way of saying no to the relentless expectations, a way of protecting some small part of yourself that refuses to be completely governed by shoot. This rebellion is unconscious. It's not strategic, but it's powerful, and it keeps the pattern alive even when the external pressure is gone. Even when the expectations are now your own, because the psychological structure remains. The part of you that needs to resist, that needs to protect autonomy, that needs to not be controlled, continues to sabotage forward movement. What people don't understand about procrastination is that it's not about time management. You can give a chronic procrastinator every productivity tool, every time management technique, every organizational system, and they'll still procrastinate. Because the issue isn't how to manage time. It's how to manage the emotions that arise when facing the task. It's about the anxiety, the fear, the perfectionism, the overwhelm. And those things can be solved with better calendars or to-do lists. They require something deeper. They require addressing the underlying beliefs about self-worth, about failure, about what it means to be imperfect. People who procrastinate often experience what psychologists call temporal discounting. The future feels abstract. Future consequences don't feel real. The discomfort of doing the work right now feels much more real than the abstract idea of future regret or future problems. So they choose present comfort over future well-being. Not because they're short-sighted or stupid, but because the human brain is wired to prioritize immediate emotional relief. And procrastination provides that relief. It removes you from the uncomfortable situation. It gives you escape, and that escape feels necessary in the moment, even though rationally you know you'll pay for it later. There's a loneliness in chronic procrastination that people rarely talk about. You can't fully explain to others why you're not doing what you need to do. They see someone who appears unmotivated or careless. They don't see someone wrestling with intense internal conflict. Someone who desperately wants to do the thing but can't seem to make themselves start. Someone who's trapped between competing psychological forces. And so you isolate. You avoid the people who are expecting things from you. You hide your lack of progress. You make excuses. And the loneliness compounds the problem because now you're dealing with everything alone. Sleep often becomes disrupted for chronic procrastinators. They lie awake thinking about everything they didn't do, promising themselves tomorrow will be different, feeling anxiety about approaching deadlines, playing out scenarios of disappointment and consequences. The guilt doesn't rest just because they do. It follows them into the night, and they wake up tired, which makes it even harder to face the tasks they've been avoiding. The cycle continues. But here's what people who procrastinate need to hear. This isn't a character flaw. This isn't evidence that you're broken or lazy or incapable. This is your nervous system's response to perceived threat. Your mind has associated the task with danger, with the possibility of failure, judgment, inadequacy, and so it protects you the only way it knows how, by keeping you away from the threat. The problem is that the threat is often not as real as your mind believes it to be. The catastrophic outcomes you're avoiding are usually exaggerated by anxiety. But your mind doesn't know that. It's operating on fear, not logic. And fear is powerful. The pattern of procrastination often begins early. Maybe you had parents who'd criticized your mistakes harshly. Maybe you had a teacher who made you feel stupid for not understanding something immediately. Maybe you had an experience where your best effort wasn't good enough, and you concluded that trying hard and failing was worse than not trying at all. These experiences create associations. The brain learns that effort plus failure equals pain, and pain is something to avoid. So it develops strategies to avoid the effort in the first place. Because if you don't really try, you can tell yourself you could have succeeded if you had. The potential remains protected. And protecting potential feels safer than risking its destruction through genuine effort. There's also a dimension of procrastination related to overwhelm. When a task feels too big, too complex, too undefined, the brain doesn't know where to start. And not knowing where to start creates paralysis. So you avoid starting at all. You wait for clarity that never comes. You wait to feel ready. You wait for the perfect moment. But readiness isn't something that arrives. It's something you create by starting imperfectly. And that's the thing procrastinators struggle with most. Starting imperfectly. Doing something poorly. Being bad at something before they get good. Their self-worth is too tangled up in competence for them to allow themselves to be beginners. Something shifts when people who procrastinate begin to separate their worth from their output. When they start to understand that making something imperfect doesn't make them a failure. That failure itself is information, not identity. That other people's judgment, while it might sting, doesn't define their value. When they learn to sit with the discomfort of uncertainty rather than avoiding it. When they develop self-compassion instead of self-criticism. These shifts don't happen overnight. They require practice, patience, awareness, but they're possible. There's a way forward for chronic procrastinators, but it doesn't look like most people think. It's not about forcing yourself to just do it. It's not about self-discipline or willpower. It's about understanding what you're actually afraid of, about recognizing the emotions you're avoiding, about developing the capacity to tolerate discomfort without needing to escape it immediately. It's about starting small, so small that the task doesn't trigger the fear response. 5 minutes. 1 sentence. 1 step. Not to finish the whole thing, but to prove to your nervous system that starting doesn't equal death, that you can engage with the task and survive the emotions that arise. People who work through chronic procrastination often discover something profound, that the anticipation of doing something is almost always worse than actually doing it. That once they start, even reluctantly, momentum often carries them forward. That the relief of making progress feels better than the relief of avoidance. And slowly, with repeated experience, their brain begins to learn a new association. That engaging with tasks, even imperfectly, doesn't lead to catastrophe. That they're more capable than their fear told them they were. And that their worth isn't dependent on perfect performance. And maybe the most liberating truth of all is this. You are not your procrastination. It's a behavior pattern, not your identity. It's something you do, not something you are. And behavior patterns can change, not through shame or force, but through understanding, compassion, and small, consistent steps. You don't need to become a different person. You need to heal the part of you that's afraid. To build trust with yourself. to prove through repeated gentle action that you can handle the discomfort of imperfect effort, and that the life you want is on the other side of the tasks you've been avoiding. Not because completing them makes you worthy, but because avoiding them keeps you stuck, and you deserve to be free. If you are someone who procrastinates chronically, who watches themselves avoid what matters, who carries shame about unfinished work and unfulfilled potential, then maybe it's time you hear this. You're not lazy, you're scared, and fear is something you can work with. You can't shame yourself into productivity, but you can compassion yourself into courage. You can start so small that fear doesn't have time to mobilize. You can prove to yourself, one tiny action at a time, that you're capable of more than your avoidance has allowed you to believe. The work you've been putting off isn't the enemy. The furies, and fear loses its power when you stop running from it and start moving through it. Slowly, imperfectly, but forward. Always forward.